For people who are kind of like, oh, fuck, man, I like when you guys bullshit about, like, statues being torn down, but I don't want to hear you do too much heavy theoretical shit. To just be patient and work with us. Yo, what is going down? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I am Troy Polidori.
And we are going to be jumping back into the Markus Gabriel book, Fields of Sense, a new realist ontology this week, and I'm very excited. I feel like this is one of those books, and I'm glad he actually said it in this chapter. He says something along the lines of his dialectic that he's actually developing. This is one of those books that is like building up momentum and building up potency, and that the more that we inch through the book, the more it starts to come alive. And even though he only gives you glimpses, it's like he gives you like the full picture, and then he kind of like reduces it down to like some tiny kernel, and then he like foreshadows about something even bigger than the big picture he gave you, and then he kind of like comes back down to size, which is a wonderful dialectic approach. But it really is picking up steam, so I'm kind of getting stoked about this book, man. How you feeling?
Yeah, I do like the little glimpses you get of the larger arguments, even though the whole discussion of, as we'll talk about later, proper properties versus metaphysical properties versus logical properties seems like it means nothing. Getting glimpses of that larger approach, it motivates you to do the work, right? It motivates you to do the jumping jacks, to do the suicides.
Yeah. He can't just spoon feed it to you, man. This is philosophy, bro. You got to tarry with the negative a little bit here. Yeah. No, when I was reading it, we won't talk about too much about this, but I will say that it was interesting because I was kind of like, but this isn't even your argument. Why are you spending so much time developing the intricacies of an argument that you just fundamentally reject? You know? So, but I do see the rationale behind it, and it's actually been really good for me because it's filling in a lot of gaps in certain forms of like argumentation, and especially figures, right? Like Russell in particular is somebody that I just don't spend any time on. And so it's been very good for me to kind of like hold my hand, if you will, through certain arguments that I've probably come at from the other end or from at a different set of first principles. So it's been really good in that sense. It's giving me a different kind of toolbox, almost different linguistic tools by which I'm able to kind of access similar concerns that I've had as well. So that's been great.
Yeah, and I imagine we'll get more of that as we go through early analytic figures in addition to Russell, like Frege, and then eventually later on Kripke.
I would imagine. Sweet. So that's what we're going to be getting into today. I will say this at the outset, too, for people who are kind of like, oh, fuck, man, I like when you guys bullshit about like statues being torn down, but I don't want to hear you do too much heavy theoretical shit. Listen, this is tough. This text is tough. It is definitely dense, but I would really encourage you to just be patient and work with us. And so I'm working through a lot of kind of like other dense philosophical texts at the moment. And one of the things that I really enjoy is approaching a text, approaching a set of ideas, approaching some concepts, not with the orientation or the expectation that they're somehow going to just assert themselves to me, but rather in a very sort of lingering and patient sense where I'm opened up to these ideas, these thoughts, these formulations, and kind of like shifting my orientation to the concepts and then within the concepts, if that makes sense. Like think of yourself as like facing them, right? And like looking at how to enter into them. And then you use all the prepositions you want. Are you in it, through it, around it, on top of it, under it, over it, whatever. And by the end of this text, maybe you will be literally over philosophy. I don't know. But
I think you just described like having sexual relations with the text.
It is, man. There's a libidinal thing going on here, dude. But I want to encourage people, like, get access to the book. You can get digital copies online. If you can get the hardback or like the physical copy, that's great as well. But even if you can't, just try to listen to, and we're going to do our best to kind of like hold each other's hands through this, and hopefully yours as well, but without just simply telling you what it means, right? And I think we need to resist that tendency. It's not just tell me what it means. I just want to know the facts, 1 + 2 = 3 type of analytical rationality, but much more of kind of like figuring out how to navigate, if you will, the complex sea of concepts. So that's all I want to say.
Yeah, so we still do our bullshitting. It's just a little bit heavier this time around. That's okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get hot and heavy, and other times, you sit back and you watch some Netflix.
That's right. Yeah, it can't be fucking erotic all the time.
All right, so we do want to mention, before we get to our several key segments of the show, that you can support us on patreon.com at patreon.com/owlsatdawn. There you get access to goodies like the bonus episodes we occasionally produce, our monthly newsletter, which has extra sticky leaves and shitty minutes, and the ability to vote on our next patron-sponsored episode. So if you want access to those goodies, go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn.
Damn straight, man.
So before we get into this talking about the Gabriel stuff, we got to do the first segment of the show, dude. You know what that is, right?
The erotics, bro.
The shitty minutes of the erotics?
I mean, it's one of them, right? It's got to be.
Yeah, I guess. I think of it more as like the resentment part of the episode.
I mean, but don't you ever hate fuck,
It's the fight before the makeup.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So the shitty minute is the part of the episode where one of us rants and raves about whatever it is that's grinding our gears this week. So, Austin, what's got you down?
So for my anger bang this week, I'm going to talk about a tweet thread that went viral this week. And I thought it was very interesting and confusing. And I wanted to share it first without comment, and then I will give you my comments about it. All right, so this was the thread. It was a conversation, a short little three-parter between two people. And the first person says, Twitter leftists aren't at all prepared for the coming wave of cottagecore, mood board, making TikTok, eco-fascist, racist e-girls, but that's not a conversation anyone wants to have. The first response was, it sucks so much because I feel that a lot of the queer, anarchist, anti-racist people that fall under the cottagecore aesthetic are getting drowned out by the neo-manifest destiny aspirations of white trad femmes who are trying to revive a white man's burden mentality with the environment. Then the original commenter, or poster, responds, absolutely, yeah. With aesthetics, the horseshoe theory is kind of a real thing, lol. I'm still mad thigh-high socks, femboy coder, light-up keyboard aesthetic got taken over by fash, so I feel you. And that was it. Okay, Troy, did you see this?
Dude?
So first, the responses to this were, some of them were hilarious, but some of them were kind of mean-spirited, right? So, first of all, there is a lot of very online jargon going on here, right? So I had to actually Google some of these terms because I had never heard of cottagecore, and so I was like, what the fuck is cottagecore? As weird as it sounds, for some reason, maybe it's just because phonetically it sounds like, I was thinking in my mind like Cabbage Patch. So I was like cottagecore? I was like, is this people dressed up like cottagecore? I was like, what the fuck? But then once you Google it, you're kind of like, oh yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Basically, for people who are listening who don't know what cottagecore is, it's a certain aesthetic of people, especially that got really popular during the lockdowns, where people who are embracing the aesthetic of a nostalgic agrarian lifestyle, baking your own bread, making your own butter, dressing in kind of Sound of Music chic, I guess you could call it. But it's also associated with grandma core and goblin core and all these other cores, right? And so, but I had never heard of it. Goblin core is it's related to cottagecore, but you're really into trinkets, not diamonds. What the word I'm looking for? Like little pendants and things like that. And you're into tokens and cool rustic metals and shit like that. I think it's supposed to be related to a sort of medieval aesthetic, but it's more about, you don't dress like fucking goblins and shit like that, or witches or anything, but you're kind of inspired by a sort of fantasy aesthetic in terms of jewelry and trinkets and accessories, and I'm sure it kind of goes into other things as well like that, but yeah. So, and then grandma core, you're dressing in long dresses and like your grandma would, like knit stuff and things like that, right? And then I didn't understand the reference to thigh-high socks, femboy, coder, light-up, keyboard aesthetic. So I had to figure out what this coder, light-up, keyboard aesthetic was because I didn't know. Basically, it's hackers, right? But it's like young Zoomer, it's like Zoomer and then like young millennial hackers who had like light-up keyboards, I guess. And a lot of them are gamers as well. And apparently, like, it was a lot of like either trans or more effeminate dudes who were wearing like thigh-high socks and shit like that. And apparently this was an aesthetic for a bit. I had no fucking clue. I thought I was pretty online. I thought I was a pretty online dude. Like, especially for someone who is in his 30s, right? Like, compared to maybe a lot of like people, contemporaries, I'm pretty, I'm in the Twitter know with some things. But sometimes I come across a thread like this and I realize, oh, I'm not at all online.
Yeah, not like the Zoomers are, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm not at all. And as a matter of fact, then I kind of feel really happy that I'm not, And I oftentimes go on Twitter or Insta and people are angry about something. Like it happened the other day with Lena Dunham. They were all mad at Lena Dunham because, like someone reminded everybody about her pitch that she wrote on like a napkin for the TV show Girls and that's all she needed. And so people are like, remember that she's really well connected and she's like the children of these people and she's associated with all these people and that's why she got, the production money for her show and shit like that. And then all these people were like, yeah, but you have all these people who they work for years and they put together Bibles and pitch documents and fucking sizzle reels and all this stuff. And they go into meetings fully prepared and they get rejected. And she is white privilege and rich privilege and all this other shit. And so they were just really mad at Lena Dunham. I went online and I didn't know any of this. I actually had to do a little bit of Google research, which I only did because I was curious because I literally saw like 20 people in my timeline bitching about Lena Dunham. And I was like, what the fuck is everyone so mad about Lena Dunham for? And I was really glad that I didn't just know, And then I was also really glad that I wasn't like super angry about it as well. Because the Twitter really is an outrage machine, right? And just like the online sphere, it seems like that the kind of like primary mode of communication is anger. And a lot of times resentment as well. And so like I was kind of really glad that I was disconnected from that one and that I'm oftentimes disconnected from like the things in the know. And then it makes me feel better about how like I sometimes feel guilty about how online I actually am. But that's kind of just a little bit of an aside because this particular tweet thread in particular is really what I want to talk about. And it's not because I want to shit on the posters. Like, yes, I do think that this language of like online jargon is kind of funny. But more than anything, you know what I'm mad about, bro? I found out that I apparently am a little bit cottagecore, and that pisses me off.
In what sense? Because you made your desk?
I make my desk. I want to move. I want to move into tiny homes. I'm down. Like, I only use Manuka honey on my face. I use a Manuka honey fucking soap bar that is like organic and made from home. I don't dress like the grandma core, like cottagey style, but like I'm all down with wanting to have like a little herb garden and maybe even grow my own lettuce in my little tiny home and have like a really stripped back, simple life. Like I got a little bit of cottagecore in me, bro. And so I'm mad that this life that I kind of find appealing, wanting to live in a cabin and be out in nature and kind of just like have a really simple life. I'm mad that it's been codified as cottagecore and that it's now a thing and that it's an aesthetic thing and that it's a brand. That's what I'm mad about, bro. I'm mad that I'm finding out that I have been identified. That's what I'm mad about. What the fuck,
you're
dude?
mad because now you're a mimetic iteration of some pre-existing identity,
Yeah, there's no authenticity, bro. I've been serialized in Sartre's sense. That's what I'm fucking pissed about, bro.
Well, here's the thing, dude. Okay, here's my question. I have many questions, but here's one question.
By the way, you're Kobe-core, and I just want you to know that, okay?
I'm not Kobe-core at all, dude.
You're Kobe-core, bro. Do you wear Laker jerseys?
No, I don't have a single Laker jersey.
Do you ever wear Laker colors? Do you sleep with a Laker blanket? Do you have a Laker blanket, Troy?
My dog does.
No, it used to be you. It used to be your Laker blanket. Don't even. Fine, well, fucking okay, Sufi is Chamberlain core.
Why Chamberlain core?
I don't know. He was the next Laker I thought of. Magic core.
Yeah, I'm definitely magic core, except for the AIDS thing. So here's my question: what makes something you do or wear or in some sense, or whatever, right? Part of just something functional that you do versus part of your aesthetic identity. So what I'm wondering is there seems to be some sense in which people who are, quote unquote cottagecore, appreciate and value things like churning your own butter and whatever. The actual like aesthetic of it is inherently valuable to them. Like it's done for its own sake in some sense, right? Maybe not entirely, but there's some sense in which that's the case, right? Whereas other people, like say you're Amish, you churn butter because it's functionally necessary to do given your circumstances, right? There's a difference there, right? You wouldn't call an Amish person cottagecore. They could be, I guess, but they wouldn't.
Oh no,
necessarily.
dude, they are the original cottagecore, bro.
But they may not be, right? They might just do it because that's the sort of life they grew up in, and it's what they do. Like when they churn their butter, they're not doing it because they're cottagecore. They're doing it because they want butter, right? It's a means to an end, right? It happens to be the most efficient means to an end given their circumstances. So there seems to be a difference between like that sort of functional necessity versus a thing being part of one's aesthetic identity, and cottagecore is in reference to the latter, right? So like, I would think in that sense, maybe you would be cottagecore in your whole like I make my desk thing because that's, fucking cool or whatever, and you just appreciate it for its own sake. But then you're not when you use like Manuka honey because you just do that because it works, right? It's not part of like an identity for its own sake, kind of a thing. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think what we're really investigating is like something about degrees of like cognitive abstraction here, right? So I would actually say that there is something ideological about the Amish churning butter that is also self-reflective because they're doing it in a reinforcing sense insofar as they are induced into this quote, apparent functional activity, which appears to be purely functional, but it's also part of a larger kind of worldview, we might say, right? That is self-reflective. So there is an intentional desire to incorporate oneself, to self-serialize within that lifestyle. Now, I think the issue here is that it becomes an aesthetic. And I use that word with quotes because I'm not using this in the richer sense of like 19th century aesthetics or something like that, right? But aesthetic in the sense of spectacle. And that's why I think this is important here. The degree degree of difference between what I just described about the Amish person and somebody who self-consciously identifies as cottagecore, for example, as an aesthetic lifestyle choice is very different because I think the latter is much more inculcated into a type of brand. And I think it's much more a symptom of course, you're going to say this, Austin. It's much more a symptom of like late capitalistic, neoliberalistic spectacle, right? Which is very much part and parcel of the desire to aestheticize oneself, to brand oneself, to identify oneself with a prefabricated identity, and then to live according to that, which is kind of from a Marxist perspective, this is very much we could kind of critique this as being a cognitive abstraction, a type of mystification. Not in the sense that like, oh, you're stupid, you're mystified, because, in this sense, like we all have our own forms of mystification and abstraction that condition our ideological orientations in the world. But yeah, I think that's the difference, is the degree to which cognitive abstraction takes hold and then becomes the sort of like frame by which we self-serialize, or the process of embourgeoisement, we might say. And I think that's really what's going on here.
Yeah, there's some element that's kind of, I don't know if ironic would be the right term for it, but the sense in which there's this drive to place yourself within this sort of serialized identity. But you have to self-consciously do, right? Part of the whole aesthetic identity thing is you have to do it self-consciously, right? Like you can't like discover, I guess you can discover your cottagecore as you did, right? But in some sense, it's not really the case until you've self-consciously chosen to do it. But it's in some sense like you're self-consciously choosing to place yourself outside of the realm of freedom, right? To put yourself in a sort of box, as it were. And not in that sense in which you're sort of like selling your autonomy or something, or placing yourself into servitude or slavery or something like that. I'm not going to claim that. I don't think it's necessarily that normatively laden, right? But it is sort of strange that identity, sort of someone's aesthetic identity it kind of works like that now, especially in the realm of social media, right? Where you kind of place yourself into this box, and then you sort of almost follow it like it's a set of religious principles. Not necessarily in a bad way. It doesn't have to be bad. It can be totally innocuous, right? But it has those sort of formal features, it seems to me.
Yeah, and the pessimistic take on this, the pessimistic critical take on this would be that, oh, you're just a fucking idiot, right? You're just fucking blinded by your own ideological embourgeoisement, right? Which you get oftentimes from certain like anti-woke leftists that want to criticize the aesthetic, the entire aesthetic branding lifestyle. But then what you hint at, I think, is something really important, which might be a more optimistic take on this. There is something free in this because it is a kind of self-chosen enclosure in a way, right? So there's something about maybe even like a clamoring for like a spirit of vitality, a clamoring for community, maybe like trying to figure out modes by which everyday communism, to use David Graeber's term, everyday communism can be expressed, that there are like flows of connectivity that are actually authentic in this community forming and this identification as well. And so I think that I'm not comfortable with that more pessimistic critical take. One, because I think it also comes from a set of metaphysical assumptions about the world that I think is wrong, but we can go into that another time. But also it seems to be critically insufficient for actually understanding how it is that the process of abstraction actually operates under capital. So I think it's also insufficient from within a Marxist framework. And then third, it just seems kind of fucking mean. Because I do think that when you actually engage with somebody who is like self-consciously cottagecore or something like that, they oftentimes know that it can be silly, or that it's funny, or that it's fun, or that it's entertainment, or that it's amusement, or they can kind of see that there's something in it that is excessive of them just being like a blind automaton, right?
Yeah, the people that say that stuff is stupid and infantile are almost always Gen Xers who grew up with like 90s Seinfeld ironic detachment from everything meaningful. And so for them, the only way to treat anything that can be taken seriously is with ironic detachment, right? And if you have that ironic detachment, you're an atheist about identity or anything involving like aesthetic identity, right? But then I think one positive thing that this whole trend seems to show is that it's totally possible to find something to be meaningful and also have some ironic detachment with it, and to kind of go back and forth between the two in a sort of play of irony and meaning. Like those two things can coexist very fruitfully. And it seems like to me like the younger generation really has sort of understood that and internalized that and inculcated that in a positive way.
Yeah, this is that new sincerity meta-modern stuff that we talked about in that meta-modern episode that we did ages ago with Seth Abramson. If you're interested in that, by the way, if you're listening, this really fits into that, the difference between exactly what Troy was talking about. That sort of like nihilistic, ironic detachment, but then sort of this desire for sincerity and to not shit on actually caring about things. So even though you don't ignore irony, right? It's like a Hegelian synthesis in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much akin to like people who obsess over genres in music. And I'm someone who does that just because, I'm OCD. I like to, classify and categorize things, and I love music. Right. So I get super into thinking about the intersection of different genres and amongst artists and in history and stuff like that. And if you take that stuff too seriously, then you're obviously just obsessing over things that are sort of supposed to be functional in some way. And it's clear from the names these kids give these identities that they're not taking it too seriously. You don't call something cottagecore if you're devoting your entire life and are willing to die for it, right? You call it that because it's kind of funny too.
Right.
People don't label themselves femboys because they're taking it too seriously, right?
grandma core. I mean, come on. There's obviously levity in that, you know? And at the same time, there's also a sort of like reclaiming of the value of grandmas and shit like that, you know? Whereas rather than just view them as a discarded piece that doesn't have any place in society, there's a sense in which the grandma aesthetic is kind of cool. And even though that's not the intention by using grandma core, there's an interesting juxtaposition of concepts there that can kind of like create new domains for creative thinking, which has a social impact and which really derives, I think, from a particular set of social practices too. So anyway, we've gone on long enough probably about this. But yeah, that's my shitty minute. I've been serialized. I've been seen. I've been codified.
Yeah, the worst thing about this, I think, is I'm thinking about, you know, I've always dreamed of myself as being like, you know, a 50, 60-year-old professor who still understands the young kids, right?
Yes,
sort of
me too.
Say their jokes back to them and make references to whatever's in the, you know, currently idiomatic place in culture. And I'm just thinking they're going to roast the fuck out of me just like I did and you did to our professors in college.
Yeah, you're going to be fucking Steve Buscemi in that meme.
Oh, yeah.
What does he say? Like, what's up, young fellas?
Hello, fellow kids. Yeah.
Hello, fellow kids. Yeah. Yep.
Yep. Sad realization.
All right, Sick. Let's jump into the main segment here. Yeah, brother?
Yeah.
All right. So, as we said, we're still working through, as we will be for quite a while, I would imagine, Markus Gabriel's Fields of Sense, a new realist ontology. And this week we are going to be talking about Chapter 2, which is called Existence is Not a Proper Property. And so we will talk about all of that in the next little while here. Troy, initial thoughts about this chapter?
Yeah, so
or the discussion so far. Yeah,
maybe a little bit of explanatory work here before we dive into the actual arguments. So remember the first chapter, after the introduction, Gabriel, the chapter is called Ontology, and in it, Gabriel is sort of critiquing what he calls zoontological optimism and zoontological pessimism. These two sort of ontological views that he thinks are sort of pervasive in sort of maybe 20th century philosophy in general. And so I have here just a couple of quotes to jog some memory from our previous episode on this subject. Gabriel says zoontological optimism is the wrong kind of emphasis on zoontology, which leads to thinking that ontology is generally somehow constrained or governed by features of human development or rationality. And then zoontological pessimism, he says, is the view that our interests in their relation to our interest-independent belonging to nature do not really matter in ontology. So one is sort of an overemphasis on the human place in a general ontology, and one is a sort of underemphasis on it, or a sort of collapsing of the human into everything else without taking note of the difference or distinction of humanness. And so, as the subtitle of the book states, Gabriel wants to develop a realist ontology, right? So he's not developing any sort of anti-realism that maybe was popular in the late 20th century. But he also doesn't want to sort of fall into maybe a reductive naturalism that might be popular in the Anglo-American schools of thought in the late 20th century. So he wants to sort of skirt between those two dominant trends on the continent and in America in the late 20th century, and develop a realist ontology, which also takes account of the sort of distinct human ontology as well.
Yep, I'm with you. Sounds good. All right.
So this chapter is called Existence is Not a Proper Property. So do you think it would be helpful to talk about this whole existence as a property thing and why it's a debate? Or is that too inside baseball for this?
It would be good for me.
I mean, the way I remember it, and this may not be the best sort of genealogy of this discussion or this debate, but I think maybe this is from your experience too, it kind of stems from Anselm, right?
The ontological argument.
Yeah, I know Plato and Aristotle talk about it too, but as far as the debate's concerned, I think with Anselm, his ontological argument claims that, or tries to claim that in some sense you can ascribe existence as a property to God, which is a necessary property, given the concept of God. And so Anselm in some sense tries to prove that God exists of necessity without actually dealing with any sort of empirical evidence, or even really some sort of rational deduction from premises to conclusion. He sort of just makes the case that existence is a necessary property that God has, or else God wouldn't be a perfect being. And so one of the ways of sort of attacking that argument is to claim that existence isn't even a property. And so you can't really talk about something having the property of existence at all. It's a sort of nonsense claim to make. And so that's a way of undercutting the ontological argument at its knees. And I think it's Kant was most famous for making that claim, right?
Okay.
So
I'm following.
That's as far as I remember the sort of genealogy of that debate. And Gabriel here doesn't mention that stuff, although he does mention Kant's use of this argument at times. His purpose is a little different from when I take it. He wants to talk about the kind of property. So maybe even a more nuanced understanding, not just whether an existence is a property or not, but what kind of property it would be if it were, right? So he distinguishes proper properties, as the title of the chapter implies, which he defines as things which distinguish one object from another in a domain. And we'll talk about what that means in a bit. And he distinguishes that from what he calls metaphysical properties, logical properties, and ontological properties. So we'll get into the distinctions between those four types of properties, I imagine, as we dive into this chapter.
Sweet. Yeah. Is this like a typical formulation that one finds in analytic literature, this distinction between proper metaphysical and logical properties? Or is this kind of his distilling of tendencies?
I mean, I don't know that I've heard it described in exactly this way. I mean, certainly analytic metaphysicians talk about essential properties, which he talks about here. They talk about essential versus non-essential properties. And I'm sure there's some discussion in the literature about something about metaphysical and logical properties as well. I'm not sure if they use those exact terms that he's using or if he's sort of providing his own gloss on the subject. But it's definitely, the different kinds of properties. That's certainly a discussion topic in analytic metaphysics. Not my favorite one, but it is one.
Okay. So how do you want to tackle this? Do you want to talk just first? I mean, the title of the chapter is Existence is Not a Proper Property, but I feel like that's kind of actually a bad title for the chapter. It feels like there's something different going on here. Like, yes, that is true, but I almost feel like that's not even there's something interesting in him titling this chapter, don't you think?
Yes, can you say more?
Well, it just seems like what you get in this chapter is not simply an argument against how existence is not a proper property, but you get much more a critique of what he later refers to as naive ontology. Now, they relate, but it seems much more that like that's the theme of this chapter, or what he calls, first order metaphysical materialism. It seems that that's really the critique of this chapter. So I wonder why title it Existence is Not a Proper Property. Like, there's something, is that because that's kind of, he's almost using the title as an entry point into this larger argument, and so that the title almost, we usually think of a title as being like an all-encompassing concept that totalizes. But it's interesting because since he rejects that itself as kind of being a sufficient ontological move, I wonder if that's why he's using the title in the way that he's using it.
Yeah, I don't know, because as much as he does reject totality as being a metaphysical option, he's not rejecting it as a methodological option for writing chapters or developing dialectic, right? He's pretty traditional, it seems like, in a lot of cases, in the way he's sort of developing his argument. But then I agree with you that it seems like obviously the enemy here is the first order materialist metaphysics stuff, right? And also the naive ontology part. But I think he's more just stating that as being a default option that almost everybody in metaphysics holds, and not something that's really something that's self-conscious necessarily. Whereas first order materialist metaphysics is the real enemy, I think, that he wants to reject in the end. And so, yeah, it's a bit weird. This whole chapter to me was difficult, trying to see the forest for the trees in terms of what he's trying to argue here. I wonder if when we look back on it, his argument comes into better view if this chapter will make a little bit more sense as a sort of moment in the dialectic.
You know what? Can we do something then? Let's go through this chapter backwards. And what I mean by that is let's start with kind of his conclusion, right?
Okay.
Where he talks about there are theoretical ontological options, and then he critiques this first order metaphysical materialism, and then let's see if that does something. Because when I got to the end, I was kind of like, oh, okay, like that seems like there's some elements of this that are quite intuitive, and then some of it where I too was kind of like, where are we going here? Like from talking about truth and facts and truth apt assertions, and then all of a sudden you're talking about existence. It was hard for me to see the connection at first. And then when we got to the end, I was kind of like, okay, so I kind of get the overall point, I think, of the chapter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, he does have a sort of penchant for weird segues and tangents, where then he'll say, but never mind this. Let's get back to the argument. It's sort of like he's recording himself, just going. Maybe Gabriel needs an editor. I don't know. But I appreciate it because it doesn't make connections to things that I think are pertinent and important, even if he's not going to sort of dive into them fully. It helps you get a sense of the scope of the argument, that it affects all these important areas, even if we're not going to sort of detail exactly how that's the case here.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. So when I say
metaphysics, is that where we're going to start?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Want to start with that? Yeah. Go ahead. First order materialist metaphysics.
Yeah, so this is the name FOM, First Order Materialist Metaphysics, that Gabriel gives for, he says, the false and unscientific view that there are only elementary particles. And he likens this also to what he calls rampant nominalism, or the view that there are only individuals and their properties are not universals, but also individuals, which is kind of contemporary nominalism in analytic metaphysics.
I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is a necessary terminological shift by not talking about particulars but talking about individuals?
For Gabriel or for metaphysics in
general? For Gabriel, and then let's say just more generally. Like, is this integral to his argument because he's distinguishing the typical, maybe what he would call mereological tendencies of the relations between particulars and universals, and so that's why he isn't talking, like when he talks about nominalism, normally the way that people speak about nominalism is not, they don't use the word individual, right? They use the word particular. So why is he using individual, and is that essential, you think?
I'm not sure to think about it, although I do want to point out he distinguishes individuals from objects. And so
right.
Isn't it the case that he says that all individuals are objects, but not all objects are individuals, right? So individuals are subsumed within objects.
Right, because individuals are sufficiently determined, right? Or satisfactorily, I'm sorry. Satisfactorily determined within a domain.
And he defines that as being the ability to be the content of a truth-apt thought, right? Or sort of makes basically, it's a thing you can think or refer to. There's some Kripkean stuff happening here, which we can talk about. About the ability to sort of refer to a thing which you can do, even if you're wrong about it, maybe if it isn't sort of physically instantiated, so on and so forth. Whereas individuals, he says, are objects that have proper properties, or they can be distinguished from other objects in a domain. So you can be an object without having proper properties. It's sort of the cash value of that distinction there.
You can be an object without having proper properties, or you can be an object without having satisfactorily determined proper properties?
You can be an object without being able to be distinguished from other objects in a domain. I think is the point that he's trying to make here.
But individuals are all satisfactorily determined, let's say, in their place, based on the proper property.
Yeah, individual is going to say you can distinguish them from other objects in a domain.
Okay, and this is because they have a proper property that distinguishes them, that is unique to them, to them. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. I just was curious. Okay, so first order materialist metaphysics.
Yeah. So this is again the name he gives for the view he wants to defeat, and it's a common one. We talked about it in the previous episode on the book, where it seems like the big enemy that Gabriel has in mind is this sort of reductive scientism or a reductive physicalism or physicsalism or whatever name you want to give for the various views here, that sort of take like contemporary physics, or he uses the term materialism, which I appreciate because I think it's the more catch-all term for what all these things have in common. That materialism says there are only material or physical things, and that's it. And sort of the more extreme version of that view would be sort of adding nominalism to it, which is not only are there only physical things, but all physical things are elementary particles, and that's it. So this is kind of like a mereological nihilism, or mereological sort of reductivism, where there are only elementary particles and that's it. And any sort of combination of those things is a mere combination of those things, right? So people that hold this view will say things like, there is no desk in front of you. There are only atoms arranged desk-wise.
Right.
There is no sort of person speaking into this microphone. There are only atoms arranged person-wise, or whatever, right? It's kind of supposed to be half jokingly. At least I hope it's supposed to be. But that gives you a sort of insight into the way that kind of ontology is going to view the world. There are only whatever the elementary particles are. We don't know what they are yet, but whatever they are, there's only that. And then they exist in mere combinations, which are not greater than the sum of their parts.
Is it accurate, you think, to connect nominalism with materialism? Like, are they equivalencies, or is one motivated by the other?
I mean, no, definitely not, right? Because you can be a materialist in the sense he's using here and not be a nominalist.
And you can be a nominalist, but still hold to what's called conceptual nominalism or abstract nominalism, right?
Yeah, you can believe there's non-physical things and be a nominalist, sure, yeah.
Right.
I mean, lots of Christian philosophers this way because they believe souls are sort of individual things, right? So
I was thinking of Leibniz too, and like monadology, and then how this kind of inspires Deleuze in a lot of ways. Because I see the word nominalism, and immediately my mind goes to like fucking Scotus and Univocity, and I'm thinking about all of these things here, and I'm trying to think of kind of fitting Deleuze into, in a lot of, let's say, post-Heideggerian metaphysics, into this critique as he's developing it. And I'm trying to think, in what way would Deleuze be subject to this critique of rampant nominalism? And is there a sense in which there's still something extra in Deleuze's metaphysics that might be... And I checked in the index, he doesn't mention Deleuze at all. I wouldn't think that he would. But because he deals with Badiou, I just didn't know if he dealt with other, like, continental thinkers. But I wonder if there's something kind of outside, if you will, of this critique of rampant nominalism that is associated with first-order materialist metaphysics, if there's something kind of in these other thinkers that might circumvent that critique. So that's kind of where my mind is at a lot of times in this as well.
Do you think Gabriel's a francophobe?
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
Does he mention Sartre?
I don't think so. I did look through the index the other day. I wonder if he is. He does. I mean, he definitely deals a lot with Badiou, but I think because he's critical of set theory, I think that he's ultimately going to like use Badiou as a valuable thinker who was like moving in a different direction, but from which he ultimately distances himself. And then, of course, he deals with Meillassoux, but again, Meillassoux is kind of like the redheaded stepchild of continental philosophy, you know.
Yeah, so and I think, I'm interested to see what you think about that Deleuze question, because I haven't thought about that, but I think from my limited experience with Deleuze that there's something interesting there with the emphasis on individuals. So yeah, keep that in mind and bring it up later if you get a more concrete thought about it.
Okay.
But, one thing I appreciate about him sort of narrowing this critique towards the first order materialist metaphysics and the rampant nominalism is, while they're not coextensive, right? There's a tendency there for those to sort of be married together, right? Like they have an off and on relationship that's pretty heated, right? And the reason for that, what they have in common is they're both reductionist programs, right? Materialism, in the sense he's using it, is sort of a reductionist program, and so is nominalism in this sense, right? And so they're married together because of that intention towards reducing things to something that's simpler or more elegant, or whatever the term they want to use for the virtues of reduction. And that, obviously, I've talked about before, it's something that I think is unwarranted and very, very bad for philosophy. So he hasn't mentioned that yet, I don't think, explicitly, but I do think that one thing one motivating feature here for Gabriel is to reject these kind of reductionisms in favor of not sort of blowing up ontology to be the most maximally ontological theory, obviously, right? But in the sense of the fact that reductionism tends to erase things that are real for the sake of simplifying for its own sake, and that's an unwarranted justification for developing an ontology. And so, I think that's probably why those two terms go together.
Okay, now I'm going to add another layer to this, and this is going to be perpetually where my mind goes throughout this text since it fits into my research interests, but I'm going to add some like political philosophy into this along the way. And I'm going to say that one of the things that I find valuable in this critique of first-order materialist metaphysics is that I think it also can be used to critique certain tendencies within political formulations, which oftentimes try to distill things down to some sort of essential truth, right? Some of them are rooted in like an explicit like physicsalism, but a lot of them also, even in their more sort of like larger conceptual programs, reduce things down to like little unit inputs, like, atomized individuals, or, we were talking before we were recording about like a traditional Marxist view that kind of like distills everything down to like labor as being the Archimedean point around which everything else revolves. You get Laclau and Mouffe, who try to identify these like nodal points that can be the kind of seed of building out from there. But I think all of these things could be subject in various ways to a similar critique that he's leveling here against first-order materialist metaphysics in the reductionism that you talk about. And that's, for me, what's really interesting, is how that there is a way that we can critique political ontologies from within this project.
Yeah, dude, that's like everything that I care about in terms of connecting... I mean, I've talked about it before, like the unholy trinity, right, of capitalism, utilitarianism, and empiricism, right? And they're all reductionist programs, right? That's the commonality between them. I mean, there's more than that that's involved in why they have like this sort of stranglehold on politics, economics, philosophy, and ethics, right? But that's the commonality between them. That's why they fit well together. It's a good part of why they fit well together. And so, they're all reductionist programs. And so it shouldn't at all be out of bounds to talk about how sort of metaphysics is going to have a similar trend here in the late 20th century as in politics, economics, and I think ethics too. All these reductionist programs are trying to create a overly simplified system for the sake of management, right? And it goes wrong for that reason. It elides things that are extremely important, in fact necessary, for that domain of thought.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so kind of moving on from there, we kind of get a basic idea of what this first-order materialist metaphysics is. He says that this is the kind of... that this is a form of, or that it is undergirded by naive ontology, right? So is this where we should talk about naive ontology, or is there something else you want to say about first-order materialist metaphysics? Because it seems to me that the reason that first-order materialist metaphysics is wrong for Gabriel is precisely because it's motivated by this naive ontology, right? Which then ultimately submits first-order materialist metaphysics to being critiqued in like a Heideggerian sense, that it's ontotheology, right? That he says that behind the idea that ontology is essentially metaphysics, that it is true that behind the idea that ontology is essentially a metaphysics, which is the ontotheological critique from Heidegger, and that first-order materialist metaphysics is subject to that critique. Yeah?
Yeah, I thought that you were jumping for joy at the idea of him bringing in ontotheology here.
Of course, man. I smelled it from the fucking first page. Not even kidding. I'm trying to find my note on it, but yeah, because that's my kind of like toy at the moment. But yeah, absolutely. So go ahead.
So we can talk about naive ontology and the metaphysical fallacy. Those are two things we can get into here.
Okay.
So you want to talk about naive ontology?
Here, you start, because I got to find my space or my note.
So he has a strangely kind of abstract way of formulating the definition of naive ontology, and it took me a minute, and we'll see if we can unpack it. But there's a series of statements he says that are sort of emblematic of naive ontology. And they're all sort of basic statements that he thinks are sort of the default ontology that almost anyone, but also he thinks academics and philosophy have about their ontology. So one is that the definition of existence is to be in a world or in the world. What is in the world has properties, and individuals are distinguished by these properties. So to exist is to be an individual in this world that has properties by which one can be distinguished. All really basic. Sounds abstract and too overly formulaic, but that's just a basic understanding of what existence tends to mean when we use it in a somewhat more philosophical sense. And if that's the case, he's going to say that the world is not an individual in the world, but is instead the container of all the individuals. So we have this sort of totalizing sense of the world as being the container of all the individuals that exist within it, and that are distinguished by the proper properties that they have within it.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is important. It's important to just reiterate, this is not his position. This is the position of what he calls naive ontology. And just up on that page where he kind of lays out that little 5-step formulation, it's page 56, he says that from this perspective, for something to exist is for it to be contained in the world, which is an idea accepted by many contemporary metaphysicians, right? And so then he says, metaphysics primarily deals with the world. It is the theory of totality of the world as world, a unified domain of absolutely everything. And absolutely everything exists in the world, the domain to which every single thing belongs. So now in my head, I'm thinking here of a mereological relation, right? So you have parts and you have a whole. And the world is the whole, and the parts compose that world. The parts only obtain in their insistence insofar as they are contained by the world. Now, this can be formulated in different ways, that the world is kind of like the ultimate mediator that distinguishes the relations between the parts, or that they're just like perfectly dispersed, atomized individuals within the world, and the world is just some sort of clearly delineated boundary, blah, blah, blah. There are different ways to formulate it, but the point is that there is a tendency that kind of incorporates a certain ontological orientation, a metaphysical orientation that presumes that there are parts and that they compose, if you will, a totality, but the totality, the world, inscribes the border limits around it, is more than just kind of like the sum of those parts. It kind of, in itself, is a container, right? But it is not a part of the world. It is not an individual. Does that make sense?
Right. Not an individual in the world, but a thing you can sort of predicate.
Right, but it is an individual.
Huh. Did he say that somewhere?
No, he doesn't. That's what I'm wondering.
He says it's not an individual in the world, right? But it's an individual.
Yeah. So then it can't be. So then this is again according to naive ontology, right? Not his position, but
yeah, right.
Right. Because it is a universal, right? So it can be instantiated multiply. I'm trying to, how can we characterize the world in naive ontology? Is it like a singular entity that is unique in itself as well as being a container? Or is that not a move that needs to be made?
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if maybe Gabriel would just say naive ontology just leaves that question off about whether the world is an individual. It's certainly not an individual in the world.
I'm sorry. He does mention this on page 56. He says Kant. I highlighted it, and I have a little note here in the margin. Kant might have been the first to really point out that the conclusion is unwarranted, right? Because he identified an air of paradox surrounding the view that the world is an individual. So naive ontology does assert that the world is an individual, but Kant hints to a paradox in that.
Yeah, which is if it's an individual, then you can say, well, what's the domain that it's in?
Precisely.
That leads you to the infinite progress there.
Exactly. And this is where the Heideggerian critique of ontotheology comes in, because the individual is understood in its presencing, right? So the totality itself is a presencing. And then, of course, all the component parts are as well, right? So, yeah, okay. Yes.
Right. And so from here, Gabriel talks about the what he calls the argument from the green world.
Which I really liked. I really liked this section.
Yeah, I did too. Although I have to admit, Gabriel does not have a flair for naming things.
The green world, the brown world,
yeah,
yeah,
the hat world,
and the hat world.
Yeah, it's very he's got that tendency from, I don't know if it's more about his being German or more about him doing an analytic philosophy style argument, but yeah, not a flair for developing names for these things. First order materialist metaphysics, that's purely functional.
Yeah.
When he does have flair, it's just to be like imprecatory with like rampant nominalism.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to title it rampant.
Yeah.
So the argument from the green world, Gabriel has us imagine a world where everything is green. And he says in that world, the predicate is green, so something X, Y is green. It becomes a metaphysical property at that sense and not a proper property. And we should go back there for a second. A proper property, again, as we said, is a property where you can use that property to distinguish things in a domain. So you can sort of take any group of objects or whatever, and you can distinguish things in that group by their proper properties. If you can't do that, then that property that it has is not a proper property, but it could be a metaphysical property. And Gabriel defines a metaphysical property as the property anything has to have in order to belong to the world. So you might think, for example, that existence is a metaphysical property. If that's the sort of property you have to exist in the domain of, say, the world, the totality world, for instance. So in a world where everything is green, the predicate is green, being green, basically, the property of being green, becomes a metaphysical property, right? Because then it's the kind of thing you have to be in the world, it seems like, right? Even though being green in that world would still be contingent. It just happens to be the case that everything's green. It's not necessarily the case that everything's green. So in that kind of a world, you might think, if someone lived in this green world, they would think being green is a metaphysical property, the thing you have to be in the world. But it's not really, because it's still contingent. A red thing could just pop up, and then all of a sudden you've been proven wrong. Your hypothesis about being green being a metaphysical property has been refuted the second that a red thing pops up, right? So he says that sort of confusion, which probably everybody in the green world would have, might be like what we're having right now when we think that existence is a metaphysical property. Maybe that's just a contingent thing, right? So he's using the sort of green world as a way of showing how we might be just as naive in our world in thinking existence is a property you have to be in the world, as green is, or being green is in the green world.
Yeah, and then, isn't the ultimate conclusion here is that he wants to argue that there is no such thing as bare existence, right? So how does he get there?
So he mentions the metaphysical fallacy next, which is when someone's misled by what exists in their given domain into thinking that some predicate which ranges over everything, which is contingent, is thought of as being necessary. So like greenness is in that green world. What he labels like he's kind of hinting at what he'll later call the first order materialist metaphysics extension is in our world. Like you might look at the world right now and say, look, everything I see is extended in space and time. So it must be the case that you have to be extended in space and time to exist, i.e. being extended is a metaphysical property. And he thinks that's the metaphysical fallacy. Just assuming something which is pervasive is therefore necessary, right? Greenness is in the green world. Physicalists, reductive physicalists, materialists might be guilty of that when it comes to extension or physical manifestation or whatever in our world.
Okay. Yeah. So it's on page 61 where he kind of makes the assertion that there is no bare existence. And so this was, when he's talking about the green world, he says that there are a couple of objections that might get raised. And it's the last one that I think is the one that's most pertinent for me. So it's the top of page 61, right? So he's saying there's one further problem, actually page 60, he says there's one further problem stemming from the green world argument that I need to address before we can move on. So he says, for the sake of simplicity, let us say that there are three domains. The green domain, which is his transformation of the world of the word world, right? Domain here, which he hasn't really explained yet. But domain will eventually then become fields of sense, but we'll get there. But okay, so you've got a green domain where everything is green, a brown domain where everything's brown, and a hat domain where everything is a hat all the way down and all the way up. Then he says, my suggestion was that in each domain there is a specific predicate, greenness, brownness, and hatness, that fulfills the function of existence. This
meaning
is what's
it's
interesting
pervasive.
here.
Yeah.
Right, meaning it's pervasive, and it fills the function of existence. So for Gabriel, that I think is going to be important because there's something imminent in the functional relationship between greenness, brownness, hatness, and the notion of existence, rather than them being in a sort of like externally related relation, which I think is kind of important to think about. But so the next thing he says is, so each domain there's a specific predicate that fulfills the function of existence. However, the objection goes, is it not the case that the green objects in the green domain, in addition to being green, also exist? And this was my thought as I was reading this. I was thinking precisely this. Like he's talking about this. I'm like, but isn't it also the case that the green objects also exist, that existence is another predicate, that existence is another property, as well as greenness being a property? And then he says, if this interpretation of the green world argument is correct, do we not have to say that it does not at all establish that our world could be an existence domain in the sense in which the green domain is a green domain? All domains would be existence domains, with the difference that the green domain has an additional property, greenness, that is similar to existence in that it is not a proper property. Again, that it is a kind of a metaphysical property, right? And so that was my kind of objection, or not objection, but question as I was thinking this. I was like, would not this be the case? And then he says, existence would, after all, have a universal structure, with the exception that the inhabitants of the green domain might confuse existence with greenness, just as in our domain, many people typically confuse existence with spatiotemporal location, or with being a spatiotemporality located entity or agent, right? And then I love this, given that spatiotemporality, at the very least, abounds in our neck of the woods.
Yeah, he occasionally has those good turns of phrase.
Yeah. But yeah, so that was my question. Like, why not look at the green world and say, okay, so it's defined by the predication of greenness, but also greenness in their objectness have another predicate, which is existence, right? And he says no.
Well, say that again, the last part?
So I thought that why couldn't it be the case that green objects in the green domain, in addition to having greenness as a property, that they also have existence as a property? Like, why not make that move?
Well, he is making the move, I think, where he's saying, so imagine the hypothetical that I mentioned, where in the green world, a red thing pops up. Well, now all of a sudden, the hypothesis that green, or being green, is a metaphysical property has been refuted, because there's now a red thing. So you don't have to be green to be in the world, right? It was just contingently the case that everything was green. It just happened to be that way, right? It wasn't necessarily that way. So can you make the same move with existence? Oh, something just appeared which does not exist. No, you can't make that move, right? So you can't have the red thing in the existence domain. So that makes existence different from being green. It's still not a proper property, right? So we've shown with the argument from the green world that there's a greenness it's possible greenness is not a proper property, right? In our world, it is in a lot of cases, right? Like in the domain of things that are outside my window, I can distinguish the trees from the river because the trees are green and the river is not. Well, sometimes it's kind of green, but that's just because it's dirty as fuck. But usually I can use greenness as a proper property. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? You could have a world that everything is green, and then you wouldn't be able to distinguish things by their being green, right? So I think he's trying to say existence is not like that, right? It's true that it's not a proper property, right? The argument from the green world helps us establish that. But it's also not a metaphysical property, right?
Yeah, it's not a metaphysical property because greenness in the green world fulfills the function of existence, right? There is no property or predicate of existence that supersedes or that is in addition to the property or the predicate, let's say, the specific predicate of greenness, right? And that's because for him, greenness and existence in the green world, or in the green domain, they coincide, he says.
Mm-hmm. They're
And this is
coextensive,
because
yeah.
well, are they coextensive? He says they coincide, and does that make a difference? Does that matter? Because I think he's getting away from the language of extensionality, because extensionality seems to, one, imply determinateness and potentially spatiotemporality, and also coextension could imply a relation, some sort of connection to like proper properties, right? As extensionality is related to determinateness, related to spatiotemporality, requires some sort of investigation of proper properties. And I think he's kind of shoving all of that aside to say, no. So in the green world, greenness fulfills that function of existence, because in a domain, there are only kind of, how does he say here? For objects to exist is different in each field, and that in the domain, there's not a unified existence domain that supersedes or that determines, or there's no concept over which these worlds are instantiated that is existence, but that rather each domain is specific in itself, in its variations, based on these functions that specify it, that determine it, we might say. And that's why he says there is no existence domain, there are only several domains, which he's going to get to later.
Right, yeah, so I think we're kind of talking about two different things here. Like, there's a dialectical progress between the argument from the green world and then to what you're talking about there, right? So the argument from the green world is meant to show that neither existence nor being green is a proper property, right? Or being green is not essentially a proper property, right? It kind of depends upon circumstances and contingencies. And then once he says that, he says, well, you could just think then, as you're saying, existence is just a thing that is the metaphysical property, that everything has to be in the world, right? That's a sort of natural conclusion you would have after considering the argument from the green world, because even if it's not all green, it is all existing. So then he goes to this point about the plurality of domains, right? And here on page 60, he says, existence is whatever property all objects in an unrestricted domain have, such that their having any other property entails that they have the property in question. So greenness could have been that property. So what I take it he's saying there is, as you were saying a second ago, existence isn't the sort of capital D domain, the totalizing domain that encompasses all other domains, which is what you might think after considering the argument from the green world, right? He wants to sort of reject that that movement after the argument from the green world. Instead, going to say existence isn't that way. It's just whatever property, and he's going to later call an ontological property, that all objects have in an unrestricted domain, such that they're having any other property until they have the property in question. So if you have any properties at all, then you have the property of existence. Right? You can't just have
where does he
existence
talk about
by itself.
Where does he talk about ontological property?
He mentioned at the beginning of the chapter as the property that to exist is to appear in specific fields of sense. So he's going to say that existence is a property that domains or fields of sense have, and not objects.
Oh, that's going to be his argument that he ultimately advocates. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay,
he just mentions it here. He doesn't argue for it yet.
Okay,
but eventually he's going to say that objects or individuals don't have the property of existence. Only the domains do. But he's working his way up to that, right? And so below that, on page 60, right in the middle, this is kind of the key quote that I wrote down from the whole chapter. He says, there really are the several domains, but they are not instances of a higher genus, the all-encompassing existence domain. For every domain, there is something not appearing in it, something that does not exist in it. In other words, we have to be located in a domain where for some objects it is true that they do not exist in that domain. And so I don't know what he means by a lot of that, but the first part of it, I think, is the key point for right now, which is that there is not this all-encompassing, totalizing existence domain where existence would be the metaphysical property that you have to be in the world. He's going to instead have a pluralism of domains that sort of don't have any higher genus domain of which they are species, right? So it's that's his rejection of the world, or his classic argument we talked about in the introductory episode about the world does not exist, right? The capital W world does not exist. So that's kind of the target that he's going for here, is to not have to say that existence is this thing that everything has to have in order to be in the world. I think you mentioned earlier something about existence being different or meaning something different in different domains. I don't remember where that was, or do you remember that?
For objects to exist is something different in each field.
Yes, that's interesting, right? Because that fits perfectly into this idea of the several domains of which there is no all-encompassing higher genus domain.
Yeah, exactly. So then existence itself seems to be a flexible term. So for objects to exist is something different in each field. So again, that seems to think that this kind of fits in with this coincidence, if you will, in his green domain example, this coincidence between greenness and existence, which would also be a coincidence between brownness and existence, and a coincidence between hatness and existence in the hat world and the brown world, respectively, right? So that means that there's something in an immanent relation between these concepts that are typically related in a transcendent relation, or like an externally related relation. So that there's something immanent to them, that greenness and existence, maybe in a generative sense, insofar as they emerge within a domain that distinguishes existence in each different field in its particularity.
Yeah, and the cash value that I think, and the reason why he goes from this argument, which he doesn't fully establish, he doesn't fully justify it yet, he kind of hints he's going to do it later, is to say, if this is true, if it's the case that existence means something different in different domains, right? Then you shouldn't just assume because everything's green that that's what you have to be to exist or to be the case, right? It's not a metaphysical property. And so, likewise, you shouldn't think just because in one domain everything is spatially, temporally extended, that therefore it has to be to exist, right? And so he's kind of likening, in some sense, this kind of reductive physicalism to the naive person in the green world, right? They're sort of taking what existence is in one domain and applying it to all domains as if it is the totalizing domain of existence.
Okay. Where else do we go from here?
I mean, I don't think we really need to talk about like Russellian propositions and the stuff about like inferentialism and stuff like that. I'm not sure that's super necessary.
Facts versus truth. Like the one thing I did want to say that I thought was interesting about that is, or at least I wanted to ask about it, is it relates to this kind of really prominent term called fabrica mundi that you can trace back to like Giordano Bruno in particular, but this idea that that somehow, you know, humanity is homo faber, like the human architect, the man who constructs, is kind of the idea that it was oftentimes formulated as. And fabrica mundi is this idea that we create the world. And whether that means in a literal, like ontological sense, that there is like this raw, meaningless materiality that we kind of just project any sort of meaning and differentiation onto, or whether it's like layers on top of it, or whatever it means, that there's this idea that somehow we create the world. And I thought it was important to understand that he's fundamentally rejecting any sort of hint at that, even in the Russellian form, because I think he sees, and tell me if I'm wrong here, he sees that because for Russell, truth claims are related to facts about propositions, that still creates a sort of like abstraction away, if you will, from his own realist ontology, which is that facts pertain to the relational state of affairs in a domain, which is a different formulation, which means that this notion of like fabrica mundi is entirely destroyed whatsoever, not just in the kind of like caricatured postmodern sense that like we just kind of create the worlds in which we exist, or the worlds in which we live, but even in like the linguistic turn, that there's still, I think he sees a zoontological optimism in like the Russellian formulation. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I was really perplexed as to why he brought in Russell into parts of this. I'm curious to see if that comes back up as sort of the reason why. I hadn't thought about it that way. I don't know. I have to think more about if that's the case, if he sees in Russell the germs of that happening even in analytic philosophy. Could be. I mean, he's going to discuss Frege in the next chapter. And since Russell and Frege differed over what propositions were and over this idea of a sense, then I think that might be come into clearer view.
And he does say that he's going to engage in the debate between Russell and G.E. Moore over something about existence. I can't remember the note, and I can't find it right now. But he is going to engage in that, he says, later on.
Okay, so we'll have to harken back to that when we...
I think it's right. It's right here. He doesn't mention Moore here, but he says, as I will argue in more detail later... this idea that facts. Oh, so first let me just say this. He says facts are truths in our ordinary way of speaking about them, right? He says, as I will argue in more detail later, this preserves another valuable insight from Russell, namely his claim that no object just exists by itself. He believes that existence, therefore, is not a predicate in the ordinary sense. And then he says that he's going to go on and engage with the kind of Russell and G.E. Moore debate. So, yeah.
Okay, so he's just using Russell there to buttress the idea that there's no such thing as bare existence.
Yeah, but then on the next page 47, he says, is Russell not ultimately committed to claiming that the relation between a propositional function and the instantiations which turn it into a true proposition only comes to be if someone holds beliefs that are at least either determinately true or determinately false? So he's claiming that there's like an anti-realism or an idealism in Russell here, and then he says, but this would amount to a crazy form of idealism, or at least ontological anti-realism, and that this would mean that nothing had ever existed had no one ever had any truth-apt beliefs such that a certain propositional function is sometimes true. Thus, Russell would have to make a case for all-out Platonism about propositions, according to which propositions sometimes also happen to be grasped, asserted, believed, denied, etc., but they are out there, regardless of our further representation of them. Right? So he kind of seems to be saying that Russell is an ontological anti-realist, even though Russell would claim to be maybe an epistemological realist. Yeah?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not really sure what he's claiming in that whole section. I mean, I have a bare bones understanding of how Russellian propositions differ from Fregean ones, and I don't find what he's saying to be familiar with that. So I'm not really sure what he's claiming there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, you got to build a couple straw men in order to make your argument, bro.
Yeah, I mean, so some of those claims seem a little bit outlandish in terms of Russell having like a sort of idealism there. I don't know about that.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I'm sure when we talk about Frege next chapter, we'll talk about Russell and Frege and maybe get a better understanding of what he's claiming about Russell.
Okay, cool. So I guess then let's just sum up. So existence is not a proper property, because a proper property is a property that distinguishes individuals between one another, right?
In a domain, yeah.
In a domain, yeah. Existence does not do that. So then the question is, okay, so existence is not a proper property. The history of metaphysics is kind of engaged with this, but could existence be a metaphysical or a logical property? And a metaphysical property is a property anything has to have in order to belong to the world. So it's necessary. And then a logical property is a property anything has to have in order to be an object at all. So that we could talk more about that, but we're running kind of long here, so we don't maybe need to wrap that up. But then at the very end of the chapter, on page like 65 maybe or something like that, he lays out the theoretical ontological options, right? He's like, so these are the options. Either, 1, existence is a metaphysical property. 2, existence is a logical property. Because it's not, he's already proven it's not a proper property, but it could still be a metaphysical property. It could be a logical property. Or 3, maybe it's not a property at all. Or 4, existence is a non-discriminatory property of each and every individual. And then he basically says, and I think this is just for foreshadowing, all 4 of those are wrong.
Yeah. I mean, he's already shown why he thinks the metaphysical property option is wrong. I don't think he's shown about the logical property yet, but that's going to be basically his point that existence is not a property of individuals, right? So it has nothing to do with being an object.
Although he does say that he did address logical property, right? The first thing. Yeah, he says we are not yet fully equipped to decide between these options here, even though my intention has been to rule out metaphysical property and logical property.
Yeah, I saw that and I went back and I couldn't find where he did that.
Okay.
So maybe he's being a little optimistic in
his argument,
in detailing what he's done. But I think it's entailed by the conclusion he's going to get to eventually. So there'll be some sense in which we'll have an argument for that.
Okay.
And maybe he's already done it and we just passed over it. I don't know. Yeah, and then 3 and 4. 4 is weird, right? Because 4 is existence is a non-discriminatory property, which would mean that there are properties which don't individuate, which I don't even know what that would mean. I think he's going to reject that for being kind of incoherent. Okay. And instead, of course, his eventual conclusion is going to be that our best option is to say that existence is a property of domains or fields of sense and not of objects. So yeah, that'll be the thing he's going for in the end.
That's really interesting. Yeah. One thing I did want to say, there was language here at the beginning that I found really fascinating because it kind of fits into a lot of stuff that I'm thinking through right now. When he's talking about individuals, and this will be the last thing I say, and I think this kind of opens us up into a larger set of concerns pertaining to ontotheology, and then we could even maybe talk about pertaining to like political philosophy. But he says, traditionally, individuals are understood as completely determined objects, as entia omnimodo determinata. And then he says that's a criterion I will be rejecting. Now, I think something that was so interesting about this is this notion of entia omnimodo determinata is basically like an absolutely determined being, right? Or an absolutely determined entity. But that language actually also can be used with reference to cost, so that the real cost is completed. And I thought that was really fucking interesting because there's something about sociality in the desire to fully articulate an entity as absolutely determined that I think fits into a kind of larger set of concerns about like cosmos or about harmony or about balance, about justice, about an adequate response, about a settling of accounts. These are the things that are going through my mind when I'm thinking about the presumption that objects are absolutely determined. And what I wonder is not the desire to define or to articulate objects as being absolutely determined, is there not some sort of desire to cover over, if you will, any fracturing in existence, to project or to posit completeness, totality, or wholeness, not even at a universal level, but even at the level of the particular, even at the level of the individual object, that's one of the kind of hallmarks of ontotheological thought, right? And so that's kind of one of the things that I've kind of been thinking about along the way here too, is that there's something about how it is that ontology, or maybe we might say metaphysics, operates that seems to function by, in psychoanalytic terms, an obsessive logic, right? This need to control, to settle the accounts, so to speak, to fully determine the cost, we might say, right? To fully pay the cost, you might say. And then I'm thinking, then that gets into like some interesting redemptive language. So this is me totally getting speculative with something that is not there in the text, but that's just kind of where my mind is at.
Yeah, I'm curious because Gabriel's motivations are obviously pretty different than that, right? When he's talking about completely determinate being, he's thinking of like the idea that for something to be an individual, there has to be a fact of the matter about everything regarding it, right? So how many hairs does it have in its head? There's a fact of the matter, even if we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
There is a fact of the matter. It's determined. It's determinate whether or not there are between 0 and 15,000 hairs or whatever, right?
Right.
And so he's going to have to claim that's not the case. And he even mentions in a footnote that this might mean that there's something to do with the law of excluded middle he has to deal with here. And I wasn't sort of sure what he actually concluded about that. But he wants to say things like there isn't a fact of the matter about how many hairs Gandalf has, right? and it's not completely determinate. And yet Gandalf exists in some field of sense, right? So, and he mentioned sort of, fictional beings as being kind of a paramount example of this, although it's not just applied to fictional beings. So he's going to have to reject that idea that all individuals are completely determined. So that's kind of his main motivation, as far as I can tell. And yet, there's some connection, I think, between that and what you're talking about, even if it's not one that I think Gabriel's sort of hinting at explicitly, but sort of maybe the reason or the purpose behind this totalizing tendency, whether it be a psychoanalytic one or a political economical one or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, because when you talk about like the case of Gandalf and the hairs on his head, like one of the things that's interesting about that is the reason, or one of the things that's interesting about it not being a fully determined object in traditional senses is then it allows for the image to be malleable, right? Because it's not fully determined in itself, so it's just simply a figment of the imagination, so to speak, quote unquote, right? Which means it can be created otherwise, it's not necessary, it's not essential, it's flimsy, it doesn't have reality, right? Whereas typically it's understood that real objects, quote unquote, in their absolute determinateness are completely and fully, let's say, sufficient as those objects, as completely determined, right? And he's going to kind of like problematize both of those tendencies. I don't know if he's going to then say like that, like images are fully determinate. I don't think he's going to say that. But maybe it's just that like nothing is absolutely determined, right? And that there's some sort of like flexibility in their appearing in domains that implies a relationality, but that doesn't infringe upon the realism of the facts being instantiated in the domains or in the objects within the domains.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if he's going to claim something like that, because it seems to me that he would probably say that spatiotemporally extended things are completely determinate. But that doesn't seem to necessarily be entailed by his position. We'll have to see. I'm not sure what he's going to say about that.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, he does say that individuals are understood as completely determined, and then he says that's a criterion I will be rejecting. Yeah,
individuals. But I imagine within that spatiotemporally extended things, he'd probably say are the kind of individuals that are completely determinate. But maybe he won't. We'll see.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. Huh. Okay. All right. Last thoughts?
This is kind of a bridge chapter, I think. So try not to get too bogged down in this if you're listening, talking about proper properties and metaphysical properties. Just keep in view the main target, which is this idea of the reductive physicalism, or, Gabriel's calling it materialism or first order metaphysical materialism. And this sort of idea that materialist metaphysics is the sort of default option in a lot of philosophy. And so that should be rejected, and we don't have any good reason or any good justification for thinking that existence is restricted to spatiotemporal existence, let alone spatiotemporal existence as an elementary particle, right? And so we can reject that and instead talk about existence as much more variegated, open than that. Than just and then on the physical.
And on the flip side of that, even though he doesn't spend as much time explicitly kind of nominating it, what you just described is what Graham Harman refers to as the undermining of the object, right? Like a reduction downwards. But there's also an inflationary reduction, which is where you say that, no, the really real of things is the container, the universe, totality, reality with a capital R, something along those lines, right? And he simultaneously is going to reject that for also being reductive. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, there's reductions in different directions, yeah.
Yeah. And that's what Graham Harman refers to as overmining. So, yeah.
All right. So in a couple of weeks, we'll come back to chapter 3, which will be on Kant and Frege, and we'll talk about it, but maybe we'll do some Frege reading in the meantime. We'll see. Maybe we'll give a little view of the notes in the chapter and see if it would behoove us to read a little Frege.
Is it a long chapter?
I don't know.
I'm just looking right now because I was going to say if it is, We might break it up into two. Let's see. It ends on 105.
It's like 30 pages.
Okay. Yeah. All right, you can give me some Frege homework.
Yeah, we'll see. I'll go through the notes and see if it's worthwhile.
Okay, cool.
We can read Critique of Pure Reason, too. Let's just do a sub-book club on the Critique of Pure Reason first.
All right, so then we'll get back to this text next year?
Next decade.
You've been teasing about doing Critique of Pure Reason for a long time. I don't think you're actually teasing. I think you really want to do a book club of Critique of Pure Reason. Now, I'm not saying with me, but I just mean in general. I think you do want to.
Yeah, for sure, dude. I'm doing a Kant seminar next semester. So yeah, I'm anticipating doing I want to do our pace of Critique of Pure Reason, so we get through it in about 8 years.
Yeah, I'm doing a seminar on the science of logic right now.
Yeah,
and
pretty similar.
Yeah, I know. And that's literally the person who's kind of like leading the discussion was like, if you really want to do science of logic, it's going to take you like at least a year. You know? And it's like, fuck, we're trying to do this in like 6 weeks.
Yeah, it's like a year-long Bible read-through, but with science of logic.
Oh, Jesus. All right, sweet. Let's clear our brains, my foggy head, with some simple pleasures. I'm putting this at your feet. It better be simple pleasures here, Troy. It's time for the Sticky Leaves, where one of us gets to talk about something that is giving us meaning in a potentially bleak, dark, cold, meaningless universe. T-Roy, what are you smiling about?
So I don't know if smiling is the exact representation of my response to this thing, but I want to talk about the musical artist Lingua Ignota, aka Kristen Hayter, today. And I sent you, Austin, a song before we were recording, so I could get your reaction to it. Were you able to listen to it?
Oh shit! You know what? I will do it right now.
Okay, so let's pause.
Holy shit, man! I'm kind of overwhelmed. So I've never heard of her before, and as I was listening, I just, on Apple Music, it gives you like a little synopsis of the project that she's been involved in and stuff like that, and that all sounds fucking amazing. And then I'm also at the same time following along to the lyrics on that page that you sent me. And so I was listening to the lyrics and damn, dude, like I kind of got a little teary-eyed actually at one point.
Yeah,
that's
you're supposed to feel a little overwhelmed.
Okay, yeah. That's not saying much. I cry at fucking everything. But but I did. It was extremely rich lyrically and musically, and then her voice is fucking unreal. And then when she mixes together the screaming and the singing, she's got this kind of phenomenal quality about her ability to, and I don't mean this in like a denigrating sense, but she kind of almost sounds like a witch, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I think that's intentional because there's something about her conjuring, But so she has like this witch-like quality that's making me think of like these amazing. Because I guess she's classically trained as a singer. Obviously, you can tell. But it makes me think of like somebody playing a ritual role on like Broadway or like fucking Hamlet or something like that.
Like in Wicked, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking
like the R-rated version.
Well, there's a musical called Into the Woods. That's one of my favorite musicals of all time. It's a Sondheim. Yeah, it's a Sondheim musical. Oh yeah, that's right. Oh shit, that's awful. But anyway, the original Broadway cast, it's Bernadette Peters who plays the witch, and she's fucking amazing. And I kind of, for some reason, got a little bit of that in this as well. So, but go ahead, continue. Why did you brace this or place this upon me?
Yeah, so I wanted to show it to you just because I thought maybe it would be a thing that you've never heard anything like it before.
Never.
Which I imagine is the case. Yeah. So for listeners, Lingua Ignota is a one-person project, or largely one-person project by a woman named Kristen Hayter. She's released 2 albums under the name. And she kind of comes from, she's classically trained. I think she went to like Brown or something. And she's kind of trained in like Western classical music, and she in her writing and interviews talks very intelligently about Western classical music, and especially I guess the Baroque period. You can see having the most influence on what she does. The song that I sent you is probably the least of the kind of neoclassical style that she's involved in. But of course, what's unique about her isn't that she can like talk about Haydn and Bach, but because she incorporates neoclassical, piano-driven music with harsh noise, industrial metal, and black metal. And that song, especially that essentially is called "O Ruthless Great Divine Director," and that's got a sort of the latter half of the song goes full black metal, which is surprising when you start out neoclassical, right? And so she combines all these elements, and the two albums she's released, I think, are absolutely brilliant. And I first heard about her about 2 years ago when her first record came out. It was kind of a huge hit on the underground because she released it through Bandcamp, and she wasn't signed anywhere or anything. And she, not only is the music obviously something that would catch your ear because it's so unique in the combination of genres and styles, but her lyrics are thematically oriented around domestic abuse largely. Probably the song that I sent you less obviously so than some of her other works, which are very explicitly centered around domestic abuse that she has suffered and misogyny in general. And that's kind of garnered her some criticism from the more like MRA focused side of extreme music. But luckily, I think she's been really embraced by a lot of the major groups in sort of like the underground metal community and in the noise community and stuff like that. So she's very highly celebrated. And so it's certainly not the case that she's like ostracized for being a woman or anything like that. But what I find so impressive, what uniquely sort of intrigues me is lyrically, she usually formulates her lyrics in the form of the imprecatory psalms, which for listeners who don't have the sort of biblical background that you and me have, the imprecatory psalms are the psalms that are centered around like cursing one's enemies or calling on God to sort of wreak vengeance upon one's enemies. Not the ones you normally read at like a baptism or or something like that, right? They're the ones where like David or whomever the psalmist is calling upon God to murder people.
The Lord bless you and keep you, and it's not that shit.
No, it's like, may the Lord wreak his vengeance upon you and smite all your children, and I will glory in the day when that happens. Yeah, not exactly the same tone you expect from the Psalms that are, recited at weddings and stuff. So what she does is she takes these imprecatory Psalms and the language from them, and she grew up Catholic and went to Catholic school, so she has a pretty good understanding of the verbiage used in the Psalms, especially the King James style interpretations or translations of them. And she reappropriates that language for basically calling for wrath upon domestic abusers and her and from the first person perspective of someone who suffered from abuse. So calling upon basically her abuser to be smited. And it's a really brilliant form of lyricizing this style of music that involves the sort of Baroque neoclassical elements with sort of harsh noise, industrial, and metal.
So this song it wasn't apparent to me that it was about domestic abuse, but part of that is because she also uses a line, "I'm a patient man." And so I wondered if she was like, because this song seems to kind of be taking place against a different target, not just like an individual abuser, but it kind of seems to have a larger target, right? So like she talks about, "Oh, collapsing lightless kingdom, I call upon the rapist and the demon." So there's kind of something explicit there, right? "Hail death's unforgiving flame, hail death's dark unfailing ocean. Oh, ruthless great divine director, I call upon the hammer." Then it's, "May every glass house split and shatter." And so there's something bigger. It almost seems like it's much more of a structural argument, right? About this fallen world. About a world or a hegemon, we might say, a hegemon that is this lightless kingdom, right? That is collapsing, and then she's basically calling upon its destruction, its ruination. Yeah,
it's sort of Jeremiah and Lamentations, right? It's kind of got that feel, except for the first line, which is a great first line. Everyone so I know is a fucking cop.
Yeah,
it's great. But yeah, and she's got a flair for the song titles. Like, listen to some of these song titles from her last record. "Do You Doubt Me, Traitor?" May failure be your noose. Fragrant is my many-flowered crown, which is a great track where she talks about being a woman who wreaks vengeance upon all of the people who've abused her. And then as she's basically killed them all, she says, oh, and by the way, I have a crown of flowers on while I'm doing it. If the poison won't take you, my dogs will, which is fucking badass. Spite alone holds me aloft. And then from her first record, one of my favorites is Holy is the name of my ruthless axe, where she talks about killing a rapist. So yeah, it's pretty hardcore and not exactly, as I said at the beginning, the thing you would smile at. But I think that she's a super impressive musical artist right now. Probably my favorite artist in extreme metal in any sense right now. And anybody who's intrigued by unique and totally unprecedented forms of art, I think would really enjoy her. And at the very least, even if you're sort of not into this type of music, I would say check it out just for the intrigue factor, and maybe even watch some videos online of her, because I've never seen her live, but her live performances are kind of renowned. She obviously didn't start out with a lot of resources. She was, independent artist working with Bandcamp releases. And so her style evolved through basically playing in abandoned warehouses and then inviting people on the internet to come and see her. And she would basically have a backing track, which would have the music, and she'd play piano and then sing. And her sort of the unique factor of it, she would not be on a stage. She just had this piano on the floor and have people surround it. And she'd go in and out of the crowd and interact with people and use she's kind of famous for using like the lighting fixtures in these like warehouses or concert halls or wherever it is, and use them as props for kind of making an impromptu lighting show. I've heard a lot of people mention that her live performances are kind of life-changing in terms of how unique and abrasive and emotive they are, to the point where I don't know that she's going to be able to keep it up for very long, because I know she's detailed in some interviews that her voice is dying because of what she does to herself in these performances, and she often ends up damaging herself both vocally and otherwise through how extreme these performances are. But don't let any of that make people think that she's like insane or someone who you'd be scared by. I've heard her in interviews, and she's very approachable and a regular person in every way. But she's part of this metal community, and there's some extreme people in it.
She's also classically trained, so her standard of vocal quality, she's going to be very sensitive to any degradation, because she wants to retain, obviously, her classically trained voice, which implies that she doesn't want to develop polyps on her vocal folds or anything like that, right? So when you scream, it doesn't matter. Like usually if you're in like a metal band or if you're like a screamo dude or something like that, like you're not a classically trained singer. You might have professional training and you might know how to professionally scream, but nevertheless, you're still putting strain on your vocal cords, right? But she's classically trained, which means that she knows like that vocal degradation is irreversible. So this isn't like, so when you say like it's not that she's insane, like when she's saying like, hey, if I'm going to do this kind of music, there's a fucking point of diminishing returns, you know?
Yeah, there's some sense in which if she keeps going as she's going, there's an evanescent quality to the uniqueness of these performances. I don't imagine in 10 years, if she's still going, she'll be doing the exact same thing she's doing now. In the same way that you can't burn every guitar you play.
Yes.
Unless you're, Pete Townsend or something.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it was fucking interesting. It made me want to listen to more, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that's the kind of thing you're going to really enjoy just for its own sake. But maybe you will. I don't know. Some of her stuff is really beautiful in the sense of, she elicits the neoclassical, really kind of epic, Baroque vibe in a lot of her songs. And so that part, I think anybody who enjoys music in general will enjoy. The harsh noise stuff is an acquired taste, and so not everyone's going to like that. But I think you can appreciate it, even if you don't necessarily enjoy it.
Yeah, when I was listening to it, I actually was thinking, I was like, this isn't the kind of music I would put on my headphones and go for a walk and listen to. Right?
You need to, maybe lie in your bed and close your eyes and listen to it.
Yeah, it feels like I need to give it attention, like actual proper attention, and pay attention to it rather than just have it be background or like motivating or workout music or something like that. Although it could be if I were more kind of like inclined in that way. But for me, it seems much more like an artifact to analyze, but also enjoy at the same time, you know?
Yeah, I mean, even for me, like I like a lot of, industrial noise, power electronics, stuff like that. And for me, even, I don't find myself enjoying walking the dog while listening to this record as much. Parts of it I do, but some of it I don't. But then if you just kind of focus entirely upon it and remove all other sensory distractions, I find it utterly overwhelming and beautiful. So if that's your vibe, then I think you will love this stuff.
Well, sick, man. Always coming in hot with the music recs.
Yeah, man. 2020 is the shittest year, but it's got great music.
I mean, I guess if there's some sort of, I don't know, way to get through shittiness, through art, yeah?
Yeah, dude. I mean, they just announced this morning that Sufjan Stevens is going to release his next record later this year.
Oh, really?
I already pre-ordered the vinyl, dude.
Of course you did. I haven't listened to Sufjan in, I mean, I have like Come On Feel the Illinois, but that's it. So, all right, sweet. Let's go ahead and wrap up the episode there. Thank you for joining us for another bulky, meaty read-through of Gabriel's Fields of Sense. As Troy said at the outset, if you want to support what we're doing, you can go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn. There's a link down below as well. Again, that's patreon.com/owlsatdawn. You can get bonus access, and you can support our habit. There's a poll up for the next patron-led episode, so go over and check that out. If you are already a patron, you can vote for that. You can tweet us, Insta us, email us, etc., etc., etc. The standard shit. Yeah, dude?
Yeah.
All right, well, I think that's pretty much it, unless there's anything else you want to say.
Just one more thing I can think of, dude.
What's that?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.